so you guys can meet Rick and Dan. Rick, if you want, Rick's got the red shirt on, Dan's got the guitar. It's the easy way to tell them apart. I want to tell you a little bit about how I know both of them. Actually, I'll start with Dan. He may not even remember this, but Dan, I actually know he is a singer from the Flint area. I think. Did you grow up in Flint, Dan?
I did.
Okay. So I had met him originally, seen him singing at Patty McGee's, which is an old bar out on the east side of Flint, kind of a little bit east side of Flint, I guess. And then while I was in high school, he may not remember this or not, but he encouraged me to get on stage with one of my friends in one of his break sessions at Grand Blanc at Little Joe's.
Little Joe.
Yeah. So it was my friend Randy and I. Randy was playing guitar, I was singing, and I think we pretty much massacred a rendition of Bon Jovi, I'm a Cowboy on a Steel Horse I Ride.
Oh, wow. Dead or Alive.
Yeah, Dead or Alive. That's what I think. That's trying to think of that. And then Rick, I met actually throughout the years. I think one of the first times I saw him was Bay City, I think, festival, talking about shipwrecks. I've been a diver, so I followed the shipwreck diving books, and Rick's done a few. Then we came to find out later, he worked with actually the person I got my first boat from, which is John McMurray. He used to work with John when he was a weatherman.
Yeah.
I think I probably originally met you officially through Dick Mole. I think originally, cool. Met you in person through Dick Mole when I was working with the congressman's office, and he was the head of Lighthouse Keepers Association. So
absolutely a good man and very sorely missed.
Yeah, very sorely missed. He's been a good man. I see. So I'll let you two take it over a little bit and give your bios a little bit. I told them already, Rick, you're probably not. Actually, you aren't part of the two people that physically touched the Fitz, but one of the few people that have ever been down on the Fitz.
You bet.
So go ahead and give a little intro about yourself and go from there.
I'm a bona fide Youper, born in an What's
I'm
that?
Phone in and move it around a little bit, so you might want
to. All right, we'll hide him for a second while he's repositioning.
That's perfect. I'm from the UP, born on the Air Force Base up near Sands, Michigan. Grew up in a trailer with 9 people we had 7 kids and 2 parents, and we just had a little bit more room. So my aunt moved in with us, 10 people in a trailer. I learned right away how to get along with people, and I always thought I was going to be a ventriloquist, but I found out in the phone book there weren't many openings for that. So I decided to go into radio, and I got a disc jockey job on air at a rock station in the UP, Q107, and that was my first job. I was 16 years old. And then I did a telethon for Jerry's Kids, as a radio station would help the TV station, and got a gig on the TV and didn't even have any college. So I was working at TV and radio and also at the bar at the Alibi in Marquette, and decided to go to college at CMU, where I met my sweetheart. We got married and had kids. And since that time, I've done hundreds and hundreds of stories on the news. But I covered a couple of shipwreck stories, including the explosion of the Jupiter in Bay City. And when that blew up, I was there live, and could literally see the smoke and the fire when it rekindled several times. Just became infatuated with maritime stories at that point. Walked the deck of the Jupiter; it was all melted, and after they were scrapping it out. And then I just wanted to learn more, and I did a documentary on the 1913 storm. And one time I was covering a news story in Flint, Michigan at the Whiting Auditorium, which is a beautiful theater there. And here was this amazing songwriter singing on stage about the sit-down strike of 1937. And the harmonies were amazing. The guitar was amazing. And I waited till the end. I told him who I was. I said I was working on a story on the 1913 storm. Would he do a shipwreck song? And it was Dan Hall. And that kindled a friendship now since 1993. We have been singing together and doing things. I don't sing. He sings. I tell stories. And I feed him the stories from all of the interviews that I've done, exclusive stuff with the 1913 survivor, with the 1940 survivors, my dive to the Edmund Fitzgerald in the submarine. And all that stuff became songs for Dan. And I'll let him take over from there.
Well, Rick came to me and said, "I need music like that for my documentary about the 1913 storm." And I said, "Well, my co-writer is a huge maritime buff. So I know he'd be really excited to meet you and talk about doing this. So when Ric started showing us footage, we started coming up with ideas for little pieces of songs to cover certain segments of his video. And these songs developed into whole songs. And then around 1996, circumstances allowed us to make our first maritime record. It's Quiet Where They Sleep.
It was a great partnership. And then Dan finally came to me and said, man, it must have been, I'm guessing in the mid 90s or maybe 2000 that you had the concert in Lexington. Do you remember the year on that?
Gosh,
I'm putting you on the spot. It was a beautiful little theater in the Round. And he just said, Ric, is there any way you can tell a story and throw up a couple of videos on the screen, and then I'll do my concert. So all you got to do is just tell a couple stories. So Dan Hall came up with the idea for Storm, the concert series now that we do all around the Great Lakes. He just said, let's play some, tell some stories and make us synergistic, with me talking a lecture that goes way beyond a lecture with amazing contemporary sounding songs. And that's where Storm came from.
So as a quick break in there, I want to make sure I give you guys a plug. Is there a spot if people enjoy both your music and your books and your stories? Is Storm even available on a DVD?
It isn't right now, and that's because Storm is it changes for every venue we go to. When we're in Marquette, we do the stories from the the storm of 1887, and we talk about all of the stories from Marquette. When we go to Whitefish Point, we do the Fitzgerald, or we did Mackinac Island. We actually did a Storm concert at Grand Hotel. So each one's done. So we don't know which one we want to do. It'd probably be like Marine City. We might record something where, and PBS has asked me to do something. So we'll work out the rights with Dan and make it happen, but it hasn't happened yet. What you can do though, and I highly recommend, is to go to danhall.com. All the music that we're going to hear tonight, except for the first song, are all on CDs, and your collection will not be complete unless you have all of Dan's maritime CDs. And a couple of the kid ones too, I think you should get. Perfect.
I know there's lakefury.com too, which is kind of the site together. Dan has his music separately. Ric also has books separately. You guys can look both of them up. So it's Ric Mixter, Dan Hall. You can look both of them up. I think right now we're going to head into a starting song by Dan. So I'm going to kind of move the screen around. So Dan will be heads up on the screen here. Okay, and you can go ahead. It'll be all yours.
Here we go. Gordon doesn't do any of my songs, but we're going to do one of his. The legend lives on from the Chippewa on down of the big lake they call Gitchagumi. The lake, it is said, never gives up her dead when the skies of November turn gloomy. With a load of iron ore, 26,000 tons more than the Edmund Fitzgerald weighed empty. The good ship and true was a bone to be chewed when the gales of November came early.
Okay, I'm gonna pop back in here real quick with Ric because unfortunately, I'm gonna pop back in here with Ric because unfortunately we lost Dan's feed, which is very unfortunate about that. That is the thing with technology, though. I'll try to bump him and have him pop out and back in. I think he just realized that he dropped off, but we'll see if he's trying to join back in. So let's. Okay, so we lost your feed. We'll go ahead and we lost your feed. We'll go ahead and drop back out and let you finish up the song.
Are we here? Okay.
Yeah, we're here. Yep.
The ship was the pride of the American side, coming back from some mill in Wisconsin. As big freighters go, it was bigger than most, with a crew and good captain well seasoned, including some terms with a couple of steel firms when they left fully loaded for Cleveland. And later that night when the ship's bell rang, could it be the north wind they'd been feeling? The wind in the wires made a tattletale sound, and a wave broke over the railing. And everyone knew, as the captain did too, 'twas the witch of November come stealing. The dawn came late and breakfast had to wait, when the gales of November came slashing. And when afternoon came, it was freezing rain in the face of a hurricane west wind. When supper time came, the old cook came on deck, saying, "Fellas, it's too rough to feed you." At 7 p.m. the main hatchway caved in. He said, "Fellas, it's been good to know you." The captain wired in, he had water coming in, and the good ship and crew was in peril. And later that night, when the lights went out of sight, came the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Does anyone know where the love of God goes when the waves turn the minutes to hours? The surges all say they'd have made Whitefish Bay if they'd put 15 more miles behind her. They might have split up, or they might have capsized, or they might have broke deep and took water. But now all that remains is the faces and the names of the wives and the sons and the daughters. Lake Huron rolls, Superior sings in the rooms of her ice water mansions. Lake Michigan steams like a young man's dreams, and the islands and bays are for sportsmen. Take the Superior rolls, Huron knows. Wait a minute, here we go. Oh, Michigan steams like a young man's dreams, and the islands and bays are for sportsmen. Farther below Lake Ontario, she takes in what Lake Erie can send her. And the iron boats go, as the mariners all know, with the gales of November, remember. In a musty old hall in Detroit they pray, in the Maritime Sailors' Cathedral. The church bells chimed till they rang 29 times for each man on the Edmund Fitzgerald. The legend lives on from the Chippewa down of the big lake they call Gitchagumi. Superior, they said, never gives up her dead, when the gales of November come early. Join it, but we got it done.
Yeah. When you get a chance, you might want to rotate your camera a little bit. We got it done, but we got it done sideways. But that's all right. I think everybody's enjoying it. Perfect. There we go. So now I'm gonna. We do have some questions coming in. I think in general we're gonna wait till questions till the end, unless it's if I see it as kind of pertinent to what you're talking about on the rec at that moment. I'll jump in. But like the one just wants to know how to get you to Duluth. I'll make that easy. LakeFury.com. Send them an email. Rick's pretty responsive. So is Dan. So somebody will get that out to you. And I'll post those links in the site. I've done it already, but I'll post them again. So I'm going to kind of drop Dan and myself off. We're going to give Rick here. And those of you online, if you will, just as the part that we're kind of tweaking and making sure it's still right, Dan's got a live kind of some video stuff to go along with this talk. Or sorry, Rick does. I said Dan. And we had it working the other day, but it was a little bit, kind of iffy. So if you don't hear any sound from the videos, let me know and we'll work that out. I can see your guys' stuff when you post it. So I'm going to drop myself and Dan out here, and we'll bring this other one into the stream. Do you need that right away, Rick?
I could you mean the picture you're seeing right now, or which one? Yeah, bring it up. Let's do it.
Okay, so I'll drop myself and Dan out, and we'll give it over to Rick for a while.
I love it. Thank you, Tom. Thanks so much for having us out here. I appreciate everybody joining us. For Dan and I, we've dropped 2 Storm concerts, which are 2-hour concerts that we just couldn't do because of the COVID-19 pandemic. I've lost a bunch of talks and I've been going stir crazy. I've always wished I could have time to write a book, and now I have it, and now I'm going crazy trying to make it happen. But thank heavens for the internet, because it not only connects me to you guys and Dan to us, but it also allows me to do my research, not only through newspapers, but all of the different museums that are still online that I can call in. So it's working out beautiful for me. And speaking of great sources, this is a picture of my favorite place in the whole world. If you want to take Tom, bring it up full. This is a picture from the ISS. I actually get direct feeds from NASA. And every time I see a clear night and I know that the space station is going to fly over the top, I make a log so I can remember when it goes over. And by tracking our Latin Lounge where we are in Michigan, I can find pretty cool images. And I love the ones when you can actually see part of the spacecraft as well. And this is the Great Lakes framed around the International Space Station from 200 miles up. And it makes them look like mill ponds. And that's always been the joke for a lot of the sailors who came from the ocean to sail on the Great Lakes. But for all of you, I know you sail. There's no joke on these lakes. When they fire up, especially Superior up on top, Lake Gitchagumi, it's 1,300 feet deep off of the Keweenaw. It's massive. It's an inland sea, and it deserves the respect. And I think a lot of the captains, especially the Coast Guard ones who come from the ocean, actually get respect because of the way the waves are different here. If we took these Great Lakes and they just flooded the United States, we'd have over 8 feet of water across the entire northern part of North America. So it's a lot of water that's here, and it hides a lot of shipwrecks. There's over 6,000 shipwrecks in the Great Lakes, and the Edmund Fitzgerald is certainly one of them. Let's talk about the Fitzgerald, because it was born out of a unique partnership. There was a insurance company called Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company, and they had been working with Wilson Transit with a couple of different vessels, including one that was built in Michigan called the Marshall. And the J. Burton Ayers was another one. They had a great fleet, and they were making a lot of money in the early 50s. Going into about 1957, they realized that maybe they should build something new. And at that point, they started to sell off some of the vessels that they had that were older, and they put all their time into this one, the Edmund Fitzgerald, which would be the largest object ever dropped into fresh water, 729 feet long. It was so massive. It was nearly, as you can tell on the screen, as big as Titanic. And on its deck, you could put not only the Mayflower that you see right there, but you could put the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, and if you wanted, there's spare left over to put the ironclad Monitor from the Civil War on there as well. That's how big that top deck would be. And it was going to make a lot of headlines. And being built near Detroit at River Rouge, it was significant. Here's some video of them actually laying the keel. I found this in a library, and nobody else had it. It was said GLEW 301, and I knew right away it was Great Lakes Engineering Works, Hull 301. Here's the subsections that built the Fitz. It really was kind of launched several times, if you will, because all of these subsections were built around the slips that were in River Rouge, and then these giant gantry cranes would lift these pieces up. This is actually part of the cargo hold. The slanted part is going to become where the iron ore is stored on the Fitzgerald. The middle parts you can actually see are the walkways and also the ballast tanks where they could fill the ship up with water when they were empty so they could actually ride lower in the water. As it came together, it was being built faster than any of the other ships. You see here a major block right there. That's one of the few watertight bulkheads that was put into the Fitzgerald, because the other parts, I'm going to let her splash in here in 1957. You can tell the smokestack's not on it. The pilot house isn't put on it, but the engines and the boiler are inside of it. They just barely squeeze those in. Edmund Fitzgerald, every time I see it, it's just amazing. Record crowds came out to see the Edmund Fitzgerald when it was actually built. They lined, you know, literally the shipyard to see this vessel because the newspapers were talking about how big it is. And this guy right here actually worked on the Edmund Fitzgerald. And you see the picture that's being held in the hands of the man in the wet red shirt there. Domansky, the guy on your left with the hard hat helmet, is on that ship when it splashed in. And he's actually hanging on to the left-hand side of the ship. But I'm going to let him tell you the story. Here's Ed Domansky, and he'll talk about what he was doing on board the Fitz when it was launched.
That's me over here at the stanchion here. When that thing went in, it tipped over and headed toward the water, and I had a death grip on that. And they were talking about that double bottom. The reason I was on that thing when it was launched, the rest of these guys and I, our job, they gave us a flashlight and some chalk. And I finally, after we got in the water, I said, "What do we do now?" He says, "Now we go down at the bottom, in those double bottoms, which is just the keel plates below the water." And he says, you listen for running water in case it hits the far side and springs a leak. It says, if you hear running water, you're going to hear running feet. But that's how I got to be on the Fitz when it went in.
Pretty amazing story, and the neat thing is that Ed has shown up at a couple of the talks that I've given, including Macomb Community College. It's wonderful to see him. These guys that I do these stories with are just such a big part of telling the story of what these ships are. I mean, they were built by men and women. And in this case, you know, Michigan had a huge shipbuilding prowess, you know, with ships being built in especially Bay City and here in Ecorse and River Rouge. Detroit was one of the shipbuilding capitals for a long time. But this would be one of the last three that would be built in Michigan. I think four, because I think Bay City actually turned one more out. In fact, it might have been the Marshall. The one that Northwestern Mutual was actually renting through Wilson Transit as part of their fleet. Here's a great cross-section of the Edmund Fitzgerald from the Detroit Historical Society collection. And you can see the hatches are coming in. This essentially, when it was built, had just a massive 3 cargo holds that were only separated by screens. And there were tops that had giant holes that if you've ever been to Marquette, you know how those loaders come down and they'll actually spray the iron ore, gravity fed from train cars in. And we'll talk about taconite in just a minute about how that goes to, you know, into the ship and why it's so efficient for them to build steel out of it. But that's essentially what it was built for, was just to haul massive cargoes like coal, and especially this is iron ore. These are.
Can I interrupt just for a second? Only reason I want to is because we do have an international group here.
Yeah.
And I know you're more used to giving a talk to people around the Great Lakes.
Sure.
I think we should step back just for one moment and explain. You touched on it, that they're inland seas, right?
Absolutely.
But explain just how many wrecks there are. How many wrecks are there in the Great Lakes?
Yeah, there's 6,000 plus shipwrecks in the Great Lakes. And people ask me now, how many are still there? We don't know, because many of the wrecks, even if they were 150 feet deep, there were salvors that were so good that if they collided or they caught fire, it didn't make sense to leave them there, especially if they were still in the shipping, lanes. So these guys would bring these ships up. One of the most dangerous places on the Great Lakes, if you know Michigan, it's a mitt. And if the mitt is a thumb on it, the very tip of the mitt was considered one of the most dangerous places on the lakes. But it was so shallow that they would snag the ships, and many of those ships would just be salvaged. There's ingenious ways that these men would take these vessels out, in many cases work just to keep the vessel, and then they would turn it back to another shipping company, or in many cases they would
that amazed me. I mean, I don't know how many times I've read going through different stories of that the ship was raised and rebuilt. Raised and rebuilt, all the time. I mean, total loss in the newspaper, which could be a little bit of creative editing, but later on sailed and raised and rebuilt. And one of the things I want to bring in, because we have sailors here, the Chicago to Mac, the Port Huron to Mac, Turner once raced the Chicago to Mac, and it always said that, hey, this is inland sea, this is nothing like the ocean, but kind of. And the story goes, and he got caught in a giant storm actually making that race. And one of his trimmers turned to him and said, what do you think of, the inland seas now? And he goes, I take back anything I've ever said about freshwater sailing.
Absolutely. Well, we've lost sailors. Mark Morley was a good friend of our family, and it was very sad when he was lost in a storm that just came up really fast. So I know our sailing friends here know how fast those will come up, and that's going to be a key part of our story coming up here as well.
And I'll kind of stop there and drop out, but I just want to remind everybody, how big was the Fitz?
729 feet long, capable of hauling over 36,000 tons.
And you'll get into a little bit later on how she may have went down, but remember, this is a 750-foot freighter that a little inland lake was able to put to the bottom.
Absolutely. And this is what she was hauling. As we go through World War II, most of the big iron ore, the pure iron ore reserves that we had, especially in the Marquette Range and going all the way into Menominee and even further up to Duluth and the northern ranges of Two Harbor, their main ore was pretty much used up by World War II. They figured, though, if they could crush enough rock and filter out the iron ore, the taconite that's there, and somehow put it into a form that could be shipped, they could actually continue to make iron ore for decades to come. And that's essentially what happened. They created this taconite, which is a process of taking almost like a clay and putting the iron ore into it as a powder, and then rolling them and baking them. And then now you've got something that can pour out of a train car in through the giant trestles that you see at Marquette, and they used to be all around the Great Lakes and Duluth, especially Superior, Wisconsin is where the Edmund Fitzgerald launched. And that's where they put in 26,000 tons, as you heard Dan sing at the beginning, which was not full for the Edmund Fitzgerald. In fact, she was capable of hauling much more. When she came out, being the largest ship on the Great Lakes, she barely squeezed through the Soo Locks. The footage that's in my documentary shows them just squeezing through and watching the sides. The chief engineer actually comes out to make sure they're going to fit. And as they go through and they pick up a cargo, they broke a record right away with 30,000 tons. And they did this 5 times in a row. And only after the ship that was launched after the Fitzgerald came out, the Homer, that started to eclipse the Fitzgerald. It was only a foot longer or so and had a better capacity, and they overfilled it, obviously, to beat, I'm sure, the Fitzgerald. And then she lost that title of the most hard cargo going through. But for years, it ran from 57 to 1975, and it was a fast ship. They called it the Toledo Express because it took cargo from the Minnesota range all the way across Lake Superior, mostly going down into the Toledo area and then offloading it where the big Hewletts would come in and scrape out that cargo with clamshells. The guys would actually ride on these massive clamshells that could unload the ship in a matter of hours. So a lot of cargo. In the Edmund Fitzgerald, figure 30,000 tons, there was enough steel inside those ships to build 1,000 automobiles. So if you figure the average car dealer in Michigan or even around the Great Lakes sells about 1,000 cars a year, they could do that in one trip with the Edmund Fitzgerald. So it was a massive ship. And she was pretty. I mean, it's weird to say that, but she had streamlines. And if you think about the ships that are on the Great Lakes now, they're just giant barges, if you will. In fact, most of them don't even have a pilot house forward anymore. It's all aft and they're only built to haul stuff. The Fitzgerald was the flagship. They knew that these companies, especially National Steel, Republic, and anybody that they could get a contract with would want to come sailing with them when the weather was good. It was great to go on a cruise, and the Fitzgerald was appointed with the best furniture from the J.L. Hudson Company in Detroit. The funny thing is, though, the deck on the Edmund Fitzgerald, like all ships, is cantered, so it's round. So they had to cut the legs to fit to level everything out, and then bolt them down, because there were times when maybe those legs weren't so good. And it was said that in 10-foot seas, the Edmund Fitzgerald flexed a lot, more than most ships. So great to travel on when the weather was good, and not so fun to be on when the weather was bad. And the last skipper that was on it, McSorley, was known to go through big, thick storms. So let's take another shot from 200 miles up. You can see the Keweenaw Peninsula of Michigan. And if you look down to where the clouds are on the far left bottom, we're looking at the very west end of Lake Superior, known by the Indians, the Native Americans, as Gitchagumi. And right past the Apostle Islands, that's what you're seeing, that little bump just before the clouds. There's some islands there. Underneath that cloud is Superior, Wisconsin, and that's where the Edmund Fitzgerald loaded on a sunny day, loaded up the cargo. Basically, on Sunday, they didn't have to dog all the hatches down, and they didn't. It was overtime, and they skipped all the middle hatches. They only dogged down the corners, and as they'd done for years prior, set sail and went out. And that's when McSorley started to see there was going to be a storm. And I think this is a perfect opportunity for Mr. Dan Hall to come in and sing his original song about Ernest McSorley and the storm that he had beat for so many years.
All right, so as he's getting right there in place, I'm going to drop Rick out. I'm going to drop myself out, and we'll let Dan kind of take over from here.
All right. Here it comes.
She was there at the dock when the lines cast off and the Fitz got underway. The sun shone down as the wake trailed out on that cold November day. When she wrapped her cloak over ship and crew and the winds began to roar, every man aboard tightened down their souls far from the Michigan shore. McSorley drew, telephoned the crew as the storm was setting in. Better hold on tight through this day and night of straight line killer winds. 44 years I have met these storms when nor'easter gales have blown. But oh, these mountains on Superior are the worst I've ever known. When he first saw her, we'll never know, on the deck awash or the bridge. But he must have known when the Fitz would groan and the bow began to pitch. When she came for the crew and McSorley too, as the Fitz rose up no more. Oh, lady of the storms, you won this year, but I bested you for 44.
Thank you, Dan. Rick, I'll bring your share back up here. Give me just a second. I'll hide myself and Dan again.
Very
Thanks
cool.
for listening.
You bet. Appreciate it, Dan. It always brings it alive to hear, McSorley's story. And this is stuff that, you don't really hear in the Edmund Fitzgerald song. I'm glad we started on it because there's a couple things I want to talk about it. There's so much that's so great about the lyrics that are there. And there's so much that was so wrong about what was there too. Now I might knock Gordon Lightfoot, but you have to know that I would not be talking about shipwrecks, and I would not have a book and 25 DVDs and CDs and all kinds of stuff on the shipwrecks if it wasn't for Gordon Lightfoot. So I mean the ultimate respect to this man. But he wrote the song right after the ship sank, and I know I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but definitely there's some things that are wrong in there. Well, let's look at the course, because this is where they left from Superior. And as they did, McSorley was a weather ship. Remember, these skippers, as all of you are who sail, you have to be meteorologists because your lives depend on it. When you go out into the lake, you don't go out there, and I fly airplanes too, so I won't go anywhere unless I check the weather, and he had to. So he looked at it and saw that there was a massive storm that was coming up through the Oklahoma Panhandle, and as they were coming up, he could clock how long it would take to get there. And it was the Fitzgerald's job to give weather reports back in via radio so that could help with the forecasting of what was going down in the lake. So as he passed the Apostle Islands, at Two Harbors, another vessel came up behind him and started to follow him. And that was the Arthur M. Anderson. Jesse Cooper was the captain there. And as they came up by Isle Royal, they had a decision to make. They saw that other ships were up there, including a vessel that was even larger than them. And as they passed there, they could have dropped the anchor and stopped for that storm. But the captains figured that they could make it, but they weren't going to take the usual route, which would take them over the top of Keweenaw, which is right up here, and just zip it through straight to Whitefish Point. So they took what some sailors call the scenic route, and they call it that in jest because they go way up north. And if they do that, they call it scenic because you would actually might see the shoreline of Ontario, Canada, especially as you get around Otterhead. But up here too, it was a better course because now the waves are building from the northwest. And as they build up, the waves up on top here will not be as big as they will be way down here where they have a time to build, as the fetch, the friction of the wind pushes the waves up. The worst place to possibly be is Whitefish Point. So up here, second choice. They could have dropped the hook and stayed right here too, and they didn't. They clocked it. And the thought is that they clocked it that the storm was going to be an hour later than it really was. So they thought they could make it all the way down to the safety of Whitefish Bay and hide behind this, what looks like a shark fin, a large piece of land and a very deep bay over here. It's 100 feet deep, even close to shore. And if they could have tucked into there, and that's where 4 other ships were tucked into, they'd be out of the storm before it hit. But as they passed Mishippicotten, they started to realize that they'd made the wrong decision. And as they came in by the Caribou Island, Captain Cooper, who was following behind them, made an observation. He looked at the radar and he told his first mate, he said, "Wow, they're in there closer than I want to be." This has become part of the legend in that he believes that they ran over an underground shoal or underwater shoal there called Chummy Banks, or on it's become legendary as 6 Fathom Shoal, although it was mismarked on the maps. It should have been 8 Fathom Shoal, so it was actually deeper than it really was. But because it was a misprint, it kind of looked like a 6 on there, and it became known as 6 Fathom Shoal. As the Coast Guard looked into that story, they realized it would have taken an extra 35 to 40 minutes for the Fitz to go anywhere near that shoal. So it's not even feasible that they ran over. And we'll go into that a little bit more detail because this is one of the big stories and the big reasons that people say the ship sank. But what we do know is that the Anderson was going along. He made that observation. And soon after they passed the Caribou, the Fitz did. Remember, they're about 20 miles north or south of the Anderson. It's a faster ship. So they start to check down. They're having some problems, and they tell the Anderson that they looked on deck and they could see some of their vents were missing. And these vents are used to equal pressure from the outside to the inside of the ship. and water was now pouring down into the vents and going into the tunnel, and they knew that there was a problem with that. He also said that he had a rail down, and most people believe that to be the fence rail, and that be the wire lines that are, you know, for men to hang on to not go over the side. If that snapped, that might have been from hogging, or some people feel if it hit the bottom, it would have broke those. It would take a lot of force to do it. But everybody has wondered what took, you know, what would have been so strong to rip one of those vents off. But either way, he's taking in water now. He's starting to list. He told them he is listing. In the Coast Guard report, they don't say if that's starboard or port. My feeling is it probably was to starboard. And if it was, now that she has quartering seas, where now you're seeing all these wind now pushing these huge waves down, and they're starting to board the Fitzgerald. Arthur M. Anderson reported that they had green water on deck. That's at least 4 feet of water. And the NTSB, when they investigated the sinking, they said 4 feet of water would crush the 9/16-inch steel covers that were on the top. So green water on deck is bad, especially if it stays on and it doesn't shake itself off. So now we're getting water on deck. The Arthur M. Anderson said they had water come up over their hatch crane, and then he had a wave that hit them prior to 7 o'clock at night that damaged the lifeboat in the back of his ship. That's 30 feet off the water. So now we have a 30-foot wave that races past the Arthur M. Anderson. Remember, these ships might make 12, 13 knots. Fitzgerald, I think, could make 15, I believe. And now, Fitz is slowing down. Anderson's trying to close the distance between them. Fitzgerald says, my radars are out. And he wasn't worried about hitting ground. He was worried about hitting other ships. He had seen on there that there were other ships, including some saltwater vessels. The William Clay Ford was also down in the Whitefish Bay. If they decided to go for it in the storm and it had a snow squall, he would be completely blind without his radar. So he asked the Anderson to keep an eye on him. And that's what Anderson did. They followed along and they told him, traffic is no issue. Keep going along. That wave now is heading past the Anderson and heading for the Edmund Fitzgerald. By 7:15, we figure that's when it probably hit the Fitz. But a massive snow squall came up. So as they're looking at the radar on the Anderson, they can see the Fitzgerald, and then that blob came in and blocked out everything on the radar, so they couldn't see the Fitz anymore. Visually, they couldn't see the Fitz anymore. It was dark, obviously. It's now November 10th, so at, by 7 o'clock, it's pitch black outside. You're looking up front, you're seeing nothing but snow. As soon as it cleared, they look at the radar, the Fitzgerald's gone. And at this point now, the Anderson is calling the Coast Guard. They're saying, listen, we're not seeing the Fitzgerald anymore. And at first, the Coast Guard doesn't believe them. Here's the route that you see, the Fitzgerald being the dashed line, and you see on the left-hand side where the 1445 is. This is where the Anderson kind of merges in, and you see where they came down and where the Fitzgerald wreckage was found. It made it past Caribou, and it was a good distance off of Caribou Island. If you look at the part, you can even see the charted 6-fathom spot, which, again, I don't believe was a factor. And I think as we look at the charts, and especially the damage that I've seen on the bottom of the ship, the stern, there's 250 feet of the stern that you can see that is upside down. There's not a scratch on it to indicate that they hit any kind of a rock. And it's most likely that, if they had felt that kind of a shudder, they would have radioed something, because they did have communication. The last communication they had was not with Bernie Cooper. The last communication from the Fitzgerald, Bernie Cooper had been up for a while and he wanted to take some rest. So my feeling is that he was not worried about the Fitz, even though we know now, hindsight being 2020, that he saw them go close to the shoal. He felt he was closer than he thought, but he still went down and took a nap. So no captain who really believed that that ship was in true danger would have left the pilot house, but he did. He went down there. So that's my feeling, that he did not believe at that point that that storm was going to best any of them out there. They knew it was bad, and it was, it was pretty bad. 70-mile-an-hour winds. But you know what? There's other storms. The 1940 storm raged at 126 miles an hour. We had 60 miles an hour for 16 hours straight in 1913. So it was a bad storm, but we've seen winds like that even in the summertime on Lake Superior. So it was bad, and it killed a ship and took 29 lives. So it was respectable and very tragic. But the truth is, we see that quite a bit on the lake. Now, as the Anderson gets down there and he's trying to tell the Coast Guard, hey, the Fitz is missing, the Coast Guard is realizing that they have no vessels that can come and rescue the Fitzgerald. The Mackinac, the pride of the Coast Guard, was in Sheboygan, and it was down for maintenance status. So even if it did come up, it was in Lake Huron. It'd have to go all the way up the St. Mary's River through the Sioux Locks and then get out into Whitefish Bay. It wasn't going to make it. The only ship that they had was the Naugatuck, which was a Bay City-built tugboat, which really was outclassed in that storm. Those vessels, the Naugatuck was launched with a Raritan. It was on the North Atlantic during World War II, so they can hold their own, but the Naugatuck was up in age. It had some problems with its oil system, and they did not make it out to the site right away. So the Coast Guard sent out an Albatross and some other rescue planes, but the only thing on the ground or on the water that they could do was to ask the Anderson to turn around and go look for survivors. And wouldn't you know it, the Coast Guard recorded those conversations. And Cooper being the first one to turn around and go, you can hear the hesitation. And as we do, I realize that many of you are skippers. You handle your boats. You realize that your first and foremost is to protect yourself and your crew. And that's what Bernie Cooper was supposed to do. But they also knew that their brothers were out there, that there was 29 other sailors who had no chance with the water temperature being 40 degrees and the wind screaming and snowing out, even in a life raft. And the Fitzgerald had inflatable life rafts and 2 lifeboats. They hoped that somebody might have made it into those boats. So this is what he told the Coast Guard. Here's the actual recording with Sioux Control.
This is Group 2. I understand you had him visually and on the radar, and you lost him in both respects. I asked him how he was making out with his problem. He said he lost those vents and he had a lift, and he said he was holding his own. The last time I talked with him, he said he was holding his own, and that's the last time I lost contact after that. Roger, we have it. Is up to no possibility that you could come about and go back there and do any searching? God, I don't know. The sea out there is tremendously large. If you want me to, I can, but I'm not going to be making any time. I'll be lucky to make 2 or 3 miles an hour going back out that way. You realize what the conditions are out there, don't you? It's to control affirmative. From what you report, I can appreciate the conditions. Again, I have to leave that decision up to you as to whether you'll be hazarding your vessel or not. If you think you can safely go back into the area, I would request that you do so, but I have to leave that decision up to you. I'll go out and take a look, but I know when I was about 15 miles above Whitefish, we took a sea right over the top of the hatch screen up there, and that's 8 feet up in the water too, so I don't know whether I can do it or not. I'll give it a try, but that's all I can do.
There you go, Bernie Cooper's own voice, and literally telling them that, you know, I'll do what I can, but to go 2 miles an hour against those screaming winds, to try to head into the storm, to go back to the place where he knows that a modern 729-foot freighter just got destroyed by the storm, didn't want to go. And the William Clay Ford, another vessel, turned around too, and these vessels went out there, and it took them until 2 a.m. And by then, of course, you know, these guys, if they were floating in the water, there's no way they would have survived. And we've had shipwrecks in 1966 when the Morel went down. Dennis Hale was on a life raft floating, and all the guys around him for 2 nights in November. He survived on that raft in just his underwear and a life jacket and a pea coat. So it can happen, but very rarely. When the Bradley went down on Lake Michigan, the largest shipwreck there in 1958, it was, again, you know, 2 survivors and 33 men lost. So these lakes are very devastating. That hypothermia sets in fast. And this is before you actually had Gumby suits, you know, the survival suits that we can zip up now and jump in the water and at least get a couple of hours where the water can't zap away our inner core temperature and give us hypothermia and kill us. So
Rick, that's one of the areas that, you know, as you know, being a sailor on the lakes, I've sailed on Lake Superior, I've sailed on Michigan, I've sailed on Huron, Erie, Ontario on the list one day. But to think of a, you know, the Anderson was what? She was she was 560, right? Or was the Anderson 700 as well?
No, she was bigger than the Fitzgerald.
Oh, she was a 1,000-footer. Yeah. Okay.
No, not 1,000. Nope. She was only, I think she was besting 760 or something like that. She was not 800, because I know that there was one that was bigger than her that was out there as well. Yeah.
But so you hear the hesitation in a captain's voice of a 1,000-foot boat on whether he wants to leave his anchorage behind a point to go back and look for a fellow sailor that's downed, right?
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
I'll drop back out. I just wanted to, you know, kind of interject that is, you know, that gives you an idea the type of seas they were dealing with.
Absolutely. And these Coast Guard, you know, they go off the buoy tenders that saved, you know, went out for the Morel and did ultimately save the guys on the Bradley. 180-foot buoy tenders that just rotate in the seas. And we'll hear from one of the captains here that actually went out to the Fitzgerald, because the one other possibility was the Wood Rush, which was in Duluth, but it was all the way across Lake Superior. So it took, you know, over 12, I think 20 hours for them to get back. Or it might have been a little less than that, probably 12 hours to get all the way over. By then, again, there's not much they could do. But the Wood Rush was involved when it came back, and they brought technology on board to actually survey what the wreckage was on the bottom. And this is what they kind of found as the ship went down. On the right-hand side is Captain Wilson. He's one of the investigators. You see the life rings, and many of these are at museums now. They found a spray bottle and a stool. They found a sounding board and a couple other pieces. They found the inflatable raft that was popped. It's now at the National Museum of the Great Lakes in Toledo. They found 2 lifeboats, one cut completely in half. And both of those lifeboats are at a museum called the Valley Camp, which is a ship museum that is inside the Sioux area. So if you want to see those, it's a fantastic opportunity to see a piece of the Edmund Fitzgerald. And of course, if you go to Whitefish Point, where the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum is, there's pieces of the Fitz, and including the bell that they brought up after the expedition that I was on. So the big question was that they had some submarine finding equipment that allowed them to locate the Fitzgerald pretty quickly. And as they went down with the underwater robot called the Curve 3, they realized that the lettering on the back section was upside down. And what one of the investigators told me was he thought that the ROV had turned upside down. But they said, no, you're looking at the Edmund Fitzgerald, which surprised them because the bow section is right side up. It's about 160 feet of that. Then the stern section, which is 200 feet long, is upside down. And then there's a large section that's been just obliterated that used to be the midsection, the cargo hold of the Edmund Fitzgerald. So to see this in person is extremely sobering. These letters are nearly as big as me. They're probably 4 feet tall, and they filled the windows of the submarine as we went by and took the pictures. And to read it, you know, Lake Superior is crystal clear. This is 560 feet deep where we went on the stern section, and all behind us right here is taconite. So we know that the ship probably broke apart on the surface, and the stern section ripped off and slid right through the cargo that was down there. Just devastating. So what happened? Well, some people believe it was a structural issue. Could it be that she was built differently because when they used those subsections and a new weld called production weld, that was an issue? Most of the shipyard people didn't think that that was possible. They said, no, they knew there would be men and women on board those ships, and they built them strong. And of course, the 2 ships after the Fitzgerald, the Homer and the Jackson, the Homer sailed for a couple more years and was ultimately scrapped because there was no need for iron ore at that time, you know, as far as having that many ships. The Jackson is still sailing today. So was it the construction? Probably not. But it could have been that the captain, McSorley, pushed the ship really bad, that he was always the ship that was making it in through the storms. The Coast Guard verified that the one ship and captain that made it through the biggest storms of the decade was McSorley. And this is a guy that sailed with McSorley before that ill-fated trip. He was a relief third mate who was assigned to come in and sail when the winds were getting a little bad. And he was taking that northern route in Lake Superior, the scenic route. And this is what he had to say about McSorley and the Fitzgerald.
Slamming into like a 10-foot wave. Now that, not so much of a wave, you know. and you could then you could look aft from over the chart table and see that just go down the deck. It was like if you had a runner, like a rug, and you would flip it. It's similar to that. But it did it so much. I said to him, they couldn't pop off them and clamps, you know. No. He said, I never heard of that. So anyway, I said, boy, she does bend a lot for a 10-foot sea. And he was going to his room, and he said, sometimes it scares me.
It's hard to believe that McSorley told him sometimes the flexing of that ship scared him. And the thought is that, you know, somehow this Fitzgerald went through the storm. And I'll go through another theory. We talked about grounding and how that probably didn't happen. The second theory that came out from the Coast Guard was that the hatches leaked. And here's kind of the proof that they had. And this is exactly what I saw when we were down there. You're looking at Kessner clamps. Remember, the Fitzgerald has 22 openings cut into its hold to line up with the spouts that would actually fill it full of iron ore. And then there's covers and a gasket that allow these clamps to go down and seal up the cargo hold so that those holes are watertight. And the feeling was by the Coast Guard that this technology was so much better than the old telescoping hatches and the tarpaulins they used to put over. So they allowed the ships to carry more cargo. And what that meant, especially in the wintertime when they were carrying more cargo, is that the distance between the waves and the top of the deck, that freeboard, was a lot less. So they had ultimate trust into these hatches. And as it turns out, they were leaking. They went on board the Jackson and looked at it and could see light even after they put all the clamps on. And now they knew, too, that the Fitzgerald did not have all their clamps down. And this is a place where I always get into arguments with sailors because everybody always tells me, oh, come on, they'd never go into a storm without having their hatches down. Every picture I've ever seen of the Edmund Fitzgerald does not have its clamps all down. Every piece of footage, film footage I've seen does not have their clamps down. And it wasn't just the Fitzgerald. It was many ships that believed that if they just dogged down the ends, and this is what you're seeing, see the clamp in the front that's stretched out and ripped off. That's from the one that was actually on there. And when the water pressure got increased from going underwater and the pressure exploded the hatch, it sheared off the ones that were actually on. The other ones aren't perfectly intact. These Kessner clamps look like little C clamps, and they're laying there. And we could even tell on the hatch covers that the way they folded up and the way that there was no scratches where they should have been dogged down, that they did not dog them all down. But again, would this have sunk the Edmund Fitzgerald? So many of the sailors said, we never saw water in the cargo hold, and this is how we ran. So I don't think that it was solely from this, but I believe it did not help. Now, also add in that the vent was ripped off by McSorley's own testimony through the radio to Cooper. He had a vent missing, at least one of them on the deck, and water from the lake was pouring down into the ship, and they had no way to pump it out. They had pumps going, but with the taconite in there, those rose boxes where the water was supposed to be pumped out were essentially clogged. When they finally scrapped the Homer, many of the engineers that looked at it as they were tearing it apart were just aghast at the design, at how it was. So they couldn't get rid of the water. In the pilot house, they had no idea how much water was down there. Fitzgerald didn't even have a fathometer. They couldn't even tell the depth of the water that they were in. So there was a lot of strikes against them as we go into it. And this is Captain Jim Wilson with an interview that he did with me, talking about the calculations only from the hatch covers and why it could be a part of the problem.
As she took on water, she went deeper in the water. So now instead of having your 6 foot of freeboard, you have 4 foot. But if you have 4 foot, then the waves breaking across the deck are higher and they have greater pressure. And they're there more consistently. Stan did some calculations on it, and I don't have them. I got them someplace probably. But, you know, and he came up with, if you were taking water on deck and 1/3 of one side of every other hatch was not tight. It only had a 32nd inch gap in it, okay? Then, and
10% of the waves were breaking over the hatches. Okay, in 3 hours, you take enough water to sink the ship.
That's pretty sobering to know that, this is just one of them, the problems that they had. So I'm thinking a combination of issues, and then that final wave that hit the Cooper on the Anderson. Remember, there was also a theory called the Three Sisters, that a series of 3 waves picked up the freighter, and because she's 700 feet long, it spanned the waves and tore it apart. That it would be certainly devastating to a freighter, but the truth is the Anderson was longer than the Fitzgerald. Here's a ship that's 750 feet long, and if it's picked up and not broken, why would the Fitz? So this is why we've got all these questions as to what theories fit and what don't. But what I do believe is that big wave that hit the Anderson sped forward and took out the Fitzgerald before they could even hit the radios. It was so fast, it came up on deck. And you can see here, this is hatch number 1. And on deck, if you look forward, and I hope I won't change the slide, but if you can see my mouse going down, this is the rail that the hatch crane runs on right here. And this is a stop right here. Look at the configuration of that. It's a white piece of metal. It kind of looks like a ram's head coming up here. That's just a stop for the hatch crane, so it stops right there as it takes the covers off, and then it rolls on that train track up. And if you look in front of that up here, these are those vent caps that were torn off. They look like mushrooms on the deck. It wasn't those that were lost, because I saw those, and we'll see those in the footage I'm going to show you. It was a little further down the deck, but still close enough that McSorley could report it. So I want to show you this same shot. And if we look at like the Texas deck here, and then especially as you look through this deck and this builder's plate right up here and the winches, watch this deck and these steps and what happens when it hits the bottom and how it collapses that deck in the footage. And we'll take a close look. Here we go over the side. And as we look, this is supposed to be the straight part of the deck right here. So it's completely folded over. Here's the hatch cover that wave crushed into. So this actually did put a big enough wave to flatten that. And as we go over, there's that piece of metal from the stop, and the rail is missing. So I've always wondered, here comes those winches I told you to look for. I always wondered if that rail might have been the reason that it sheared off those vents. That would have been heavy enough, and when the ship flexed, those long steel, essentially railroad tracks would be like missiles coming off of there. The problem with my theory is that probably happened on the bottom when it hit, because that piece of metal, that stop, is still there. Now, if it's bolted there, then maybe not. But look at this. This is supposed to be attached to the Fitzgerald. When it hit, it tore away from the port side of the ship. Here's the hull, and here's the spar deck. That is because of the weight of 26,000 tons of taconite hit, and it just exploded the sides out of the ship as it went down, crunching the forward end and burying it into what I call an underwater hillside. On the other side, on the port or the starboard side, it's actually 30 feet down. But look at this. You've got actual lake bottom all the way up to the lettering on the Fitzgerald, almost up to the spar deck. This is an underwater hill that it landed into, or a furrow that it might have even skidded into. So it stopped it there. And the damage on this side is significant. On the other side, you can actually tell where the anchor pocket collapsed in. So the forward momentum was intense as it came down here. This was probably the most sobering shot for me. As we went down, I was the 3rd dive in the submarine, and to go over the name all beat up like that, you realize the torment that this ship went through at that point. Now, as they started to talk about, what might have sank it, the Coast Guard was very, very non-committal. They said it perhaps was the hatch covers, but they did not come up with a conclusive reason. And immediately they said, but we are going to make sure that ships don't carry that much cargo in the winter, and we're going to look at maybe putting watertight subdivisions inside the ships. Now, you're talking about, dozens of ships for the Lake Carriers Association who own them did not want to make these modifications. So they were really, heck bent on following the theory that it ran aground. Captain McSorley hit it, and it was his fault. He's dead, and that's it. And it just didn't hold water to me, if you'll forgive the pun. I think that it was just a convenient excuse because they did not want to haul less cargo in the winter. They did not want to put in these subdivisions, which they never did. And I think that that's part of the reason why that theory came out. It also took the blame off of the crew, which really, I think it does make the families feel better, but I don't blame the crew for that. The decision to put those hatch clamps on is the first mate's decision. That's not the crew they follow the orders and they do it. And he decided not to put them on. And the captain obviously knew that they weren't going to either when conditions were good. And when conditions were bad, one of the broadcasts they did hear from McSorley was don't go out on deck. They did not have time to do anything with them at that point. So I'd like to spend a couple minutes, maybe 3 minutes, going over the investigations that started in 1976 with the Coast Guard and went up to my expedition. And then after that, it goes into the bell raising. So here's a synopsis of all the people who visited the Fitzgerald, all the major expeditions that have been there since 1976.
I just wanted to inject one quick thing while you're doing that. Yeah. Time is money is why those aren't always hatched or always clamped. They wanted to get loaded, get out of harbor and on their way, because each hour they could shave on each trip is another trip they can do at the end of the year.
Absolutely. Yeah. But, and again, I think it's real easy to blame shipping companies, to blame captains and say, for the greed of money, and that might make for a great book. But the truth is nobody wants to die. They all believe that they can get their ships through. And they all believe, like McSorley did, that he's been through storms and he's been through stuff probably worse than this, and that they would make it through. But there was a compounded amount of problems that were going on here. And unfortunately, that's what happened. All right, here's their story.
Only a handful of explorers have gained permission to dive the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, located over 500 feet down in Lake Superior's icy water. In 1976, the Coast Guard lowered the Curve 3, a special remote-operated vehicle that could record video and snap pictures. It revealed that the Fitz was ripped into two main sections, the bow upright, the stern upside down. In 1980, Jacques Cousteau's team were the first humans to dive down to the wreck, exploring the bow section and reporting extensive damage that they believed was caused by a surface breakup. 9 years later, Whitefish Point led a team with a 3D camera to explore the site remotely. An open door was found in the pilot house, leading some to believe it was an escape attempt as the Fitz made its final plunge. In 1994, submersibles again visited the wreck. In early July, Harbor Branch Oceanographic sent several teams down in the Clelia, and only a few weeks later, the Delta looked for clues. At the end of the first day of diving, the Delta subcrew found a sailor's body lying on the lake bottom near the bow section.
So quiet and dark down there reminds me of a church, and knowing that God's down there. It's quiet where they sleep, no more the tempest roar.
Headlines were quick to admonish the team, and the state of Michigan passed a law banning the use of footage taken. A final dive with the Canadian Navy removed the ship's bell, and many family members of the lost crew called for a ban on diving the Edmund Fitzgerald. A later deepwater sonar scan revealed what appeared to be substantial damage to the spar deck of the Fitz, a teasing clue to a shipwreck that still largely remains a mystery some 40 years later.
That's a good look at really what all the investigations kind of played into, and each one did bring a new fact to the surface. Ours was the Delta, and as I mentioned, the third dive was mine. Over an hour and a half down on the wreck. We were lost for most of it, and came up on the bow section, and then managed to go around, got lost again, came up on the stern section. The devastation was just, I mean, it took your breath away on how bad it was, and yet there were things out there that made it very human. I saw a screwdriver stuck in the mud. I saw a Columbia logo cup on the bottom, and there was part of me that wished we could take the sub claw and reach out and grab it, but I knew that nothing in there should be touched, and it was against the law. It's in Canadian waters. It's right over the edge of the border between U.S. and Canada. And it's in 550 feet of water, and they're protecting it. The only thing that's ever come up is the bell and a couple of taconite pellets that Whitefish Point, when they went down, said they scooped them up with the submarine or the ROV by accident. And when they brought them up, they realized they were there, and they called the Canadian government and said they were going to throw them back. And according to a guy I talked to from the expedition, he said they told him it'd be littering if they brought them back. So they kept them. And what amazing keepsakes. And quite honestly, something that I don't think I could keep. As we came back, now the dive after mine, you saw the young man there. That was the tug owner's son. Their name was Jack Purvis. Yeah.
I lost my my feed to Rick, so I don't know which one he wants me to do. So I'm just going to do both of them right in a row here. I'm going to start with It's Quiet Where They Sleep. It's quiet where they sleep, no more the tempest roar. It's quiet where they sleep, upon Superior's floor. 500 feet of black cold wave is a fitting stone for Fitzgerald's grave. Her pilot house glass has a deathly gaze, and it's quiet where they sleep. It's quiet where they sleep, no more the tempest roar. It's quiet where they sleep, upon Superior's floor. 500 feet of black cold wave is a fitting stone for Fitzgerald's grave. Her pilot house glass has a deathly gaze, and it's quiet where they sleep. He gathered the crewmen so they would know the reason that he well intended to turn the ship around and go back to that fury in hopes that some sailor would not have to drown. Well, I know I'm the captain, and you all would follow wherever I order. Whatever I say, we have beat the wind's terror and reached the bay shelter. But Fitzgerald's gone a-missing within the cruel waves. He stood with arms folded, waiting for an answer. His mate plotted course back out to the lake. Each man was in favor. The Anderson was storm-bound, searching for sailors, whatever it takes. Only Arthur M. Anderson still sails the water. Captain Cooper's gone now. In 93 he died. Another skipper charts her ship he loved so dearly. But the legend of Cooper and Fitzgerald didn't die. Whenever the storms rake the lakes with their vengeance, the spirit of Cooper remains in command. Well, now Cooper is a legend. On the bridge of that vessel, he held to the rail as the seas ripped her side and left Whitefish Bay for the grave of Fitzgerald, knowing in his heart that every man had died. Bernie Cooper was a captain of historic tradition. He knew well that sailors were all brothers at sea, so facing the wind, he risked ship and crewmen, returning to danger, finding only debris. Oh, the Arthur M. Anderson still sails the water. Captain Cooper's gone now. In 93 he died. Another skipper charts her, the ship he loved so dearly. But the legend of Cooper and Fitzgerald didn't die. Whenever the storms rake the lakes with their vengeance, the spirit of Cooper remains in command. From sunsets on Huron to dawns on Superior, along the autumn rivers, gold lining their sides, the freighters glide slowly, their holds deep in iron. Oh, the waves whisper quiet, where many men have died, but as long as brave sailors still sail the waters, Captain Cooper watches as each station is manned, and the night watch hear footsteps on the bridge of that lady who no finer captain will ever command. Oh, the Arthur M. Anderson still sails the waters. Captain Cooper's gone now. In 93 he died. Another skipper charts her, the ship he loved so dearly. But the legend of Cooper and Fitzgerald didn't die. Whenever the storms rake the lakes with their vengeance, the spirit of Cooper remains in command.
Now you guys know why I keep this guy around. Dan, it's just amazing. It's great to hear you. I wish it was so much better quality than, man. We'll be back together soon, and as people know, I'll put up an address here in just a second to for people to be able to follow along where our concerts are going to be. We do have 2 more, 3 more, actually 4 more now scheduled for this fall, and our hopes and prayers are that this pandemic gets over with so that we can get together and do what we love to do, and that's the full 2-hour show. Each show is different, so if you can see us anywhere around the Great Lakes, our hope is to hit Wisconsin and Minnesota coming up. And Dan, I can't wait. We've got new songs to write too as well. There's always new stories to tell.
Yeah, no, I definitely want to thank you guys for coming on. I know there's a little bit left here still in the presentation, but a chance to kind of take a break here. And question wise, everybody, I mean, I kind of went through and most of them are just grateful comments. No specific question, other than how to get you guys to Duluth that we had earlier. And I'm sure we can figure out a way to get you guys to do that at some point. You've probably done Duluth before.
Duluth, I've never been there, so that'd be great.
Oh man, it's so cool. And they're a festival they have in the fall, which they've been talking about getting stormed there, called Gales of November. You know, here's where the Fitzgerald, you know, came from. This is Superior, Wisconsin, and Duluth, Minnesota, our sister cities, if you will, pretty close to each other, separated by a good water system. And Dan, they would be thrilled to have you up there. So many songs. He's got 2 full CDs at danhall.com. I hope that you guys will go in there and download songs. I think you can even individually download songs too, can't you, Dan?
I think his feed froze a little bit on us.
No worries.
I can't hear Rick.
I was just going to say that you can download individual songs. I
lost Rick somewhere along the way.
Okay. Can you hear me, Dan, or not?
Yes, I can hear you, brother.
Okay, so Rick had just basically said he was giving you a promo, telling him to go to your site and you know, download individual songs. And actually, Rick, if you don't mind, I'm gonna put Dan on the spot for a second. If that's all right.
Yeah.
Yeah. 2 songs, and your choice of the 2 from my probably youth childhood that I remember you singing. That I'd like to hear either Asabo or fried green tomatoes, or homegrown tomatoes. Sorry.
Guy Clark wrote this song. God rest his soul. Here we go. For you, Tom.
Thank you.
There ain't nothing in the world that I like better than bacon and lettuce and homegrown tomatoes. Up in the morning, out in the garden, and get you a ripe one. But don't pick a hard one, plant them in spring. Eat them in the summer, all winter without them. So culinary bummer. I forget all about sweating and digging. Every time I go out and get me a biggin'. Now, homegrown tomatoes, homegrown tomatoes. What'd life be without homegrown tomatoes? Only 2 things that money can't buy, and that's true love and homegrown tomatoes. Well, you can go out to eat, yep, that's for sure. There's nothing that a homegrown tomato won't cure. Put them in salad or stick them in your stew, or you can make your own very own tomato juice. And you can eat them with eggs, eat them with gravy, eat them with beans, man, pinto or navy. Put them on the side or put them in the middle. Got a homegrown tomato on a hot cake griddle. Homegrown tomatoes, homegrown tomatoes. What'd life be without homegrown tomatoes? Only 2 things that money can't buy, and that's true love and homegrown tomatoes. I eat. Oh, burn it up, Dan. See, I like homegrown tomatoes, especially them big old red and ripe around juicy ones. Man, I love those. But those little green ones are good too if you cut them up thin and put them in a frying pan with a little Parmesan cheese and a stick of butter and a squish of lemon. Oh man, just like old Jed Clampett used to always say. He'd say, "Wee doggy." Well, if I could change this life I lead, y'all could call me Johnny Tomato Seed. 'Cause I know what this country needs is homegrown tomatoes in every yard you see, man. And when I die, don't bury me in a box in a cold, dark cemetery. No, out in the garden it'd be so much better. Or I could be a pushing up homegrown tomatoes, homegrown tomatoes, homegrown tomatoes. What'd life be without homegrown tomatoes? Only 2 things that money can't buy, and that's true love. And one more time, man, homegrown tomatoes, homegrown tomatoes. What'd life be without homegrown tomatoes? Only 2 things that money can't buy, and that's true love and homegrown tomatoes.
I love
Thank
it.
you, Dan. Yeah, thanks, Dan. I appreciate that. So we do have some comments. I don't know if you guys can see them, so I want to let you know. First, Dan Hall singing is wonderful. That's one of the ones there. And a couple people say, now you're talking my neck of the woods singing that type of song. But then actually I have one for you, Rick. It's and I think I know the answer, but I'll let you answer it.
Yeah.
Did the Fitz ever haul anything other than ore?
Well, what do you think the answer is, Tom? Come on.
For the most part, no, because their cargo was either full of ore or salt or, you know, something of those natures. But probably northbound, she's hauling salt, I would guess.
Well, Fitz never hauled salt, but no, and you're right. I mean, many of the freighters would do, they'd try to haul one way, they'd come up with coal, and then they'd come down from Duluth hauling iron ore. So they did haul a lot of coal. I don't know of any cargoes of salt or grain, which some did. And that was a big switchover because they have to really clean it out well to haul anything like grain, especially. But, you know, the grain trade, as we go into the, you know, the 50s and 60s, was not nearly what we had in the 1860s and 1870s when, you know, Toledo and especially Buffalo was the main place for grain to come in. So now it's mostly almost 90%, I think, of the cargo is iron ore. And by the 1950s, you know, we had a bottom fall out just as the Fitzgerald was launched. The cargo iron ore market was horrible, unfortunately, for Northwest Mutual. By the way, the name Edmund Fitzgerald came from the president of that insurance company that was the owners of the ship. So in the company that actually chartered it, Columbia, was actually named for another shipwreck, which the painting of that wreck, it was a schooner called Columbia, the first one to haul iron ore through the Sioux Locks. And that one sank in Death's Door, Wisconsin. So there's a painting that was hanging right inside the Fitzgerald. We wondered for years if that was still there because that was the one that Edmund Fitzgerald himself had commissioned and hung in the Fitz. And I'm pretty sure it was in there because it was in footage that I saw about 2 captains before McSorley.
Okay, so you got a little bit left of the presentation yet, or was that?
Yeah, I just, you know, we're still a lot of questions. You know, we, out of respect for the families, it's a very difficult way to get to the wreck. It is not completely sealed off. A lot of people will post how it's off limits to go to it. It is without a permit, but my feeling is that you can still petition the Ontario government to go and dive it. You just have to have a good reason. Will we ever see where, you know, like ordinary citizens like we did, chartered our own submarine and paid for it, you know, and went down? It probably won't happen again. But if you get Bob Ballard, who found Titanic, or even one of Jacques Cousteau's son, Jean-Michel, who was down in that first expedition, was actually in charge of sending the divers down. If he asked, I bet you'd get to go again. And I think that's just it's just a matter of time now. And a lot of those family members, we understand, are upset that people go down there. But I've visited over 150 shipwrecks, and many of them, all of them, didn't have a song like Gordon Lightfoot, you know, had #2 on the charts to preserve their history. So Dan and I are going to go through and preserve all of these stories through, you know, not only live interviews that we've done and recorded those, but songs and presentations, so that those stories don't get lost. And with Gordon's song, there's stuff wrong with it. It wasn't loaded fully for Cleveland. It was loaded for Zug Island, which, if anybody follows the news, in Detroit, Zug Island was just closed down. It's very sad with the economy, and now with the devastation of COVID, it's just not going to reopen. It's going cold now, and we won't see production there anymore, or ships going inside there. Henry Ford also had a major fleet that went in through there, and it's going to be pretty quiet now. So that's it. We're still looking for clues. We still don't know exactly why it sank, and I hope to go back. I mean, it's just we respected the area where we found the sailor's body that was down there. We filmed it for the government. That was part of our license. We only used a very small snippet that was not identifiable, even as a body, and put it in the documentary. And I'm very proud of the work that we've done there, even though, you know, there's a lot of bad press from our expedition, because it did make some family members sad.
Well, I know I did try to remote into your computer and find that footage, and you had it hid well. But but no, I appreciate you guys, you know, coming on. You know, if you know, Dan wants to close out with another song, or a couple people had asked beforehand, and you guys aren't committed to it at all. I didn't. Is doing like an after-hour live go into Zoom for a few minutes. If you guys want to join, welcome to. I'm going to do it anyway, just so they can talk and you know, like I said, it's a happy hour event too, kind of. So some of them may. Well,
if you want to call up this last slide, I can give people a place where they can find more stories for free too.
Yeah, let me pull that up here, and I'll hide myself, so it's just you two.
No worries. Take a look at this. This is shipwreckpodcast.com. I've taken some of my greatest interviews.
Rick.
What's that? What's that, Dan? Oh, you can't hear me now or what? Shipwreck podcast.com has all of my stories that are on in an audio format. You can download for free. Go up there, and I think there's 8 different programs that are on there now. LakeFury.com also has all of the tour information for myself and for Dan, so you can find out where we're playing around the Great Lakes. We would love to see you in person. To hear Dan in a theater is amazing, and when we get the whole band together, it's just magical. So that's our hope to do it again. But maybe we can pull that slide out so Dan can hear me again. I don't think he can.
All right.
There we go. All right.
Can you hear him now, Dan?
No.
So
Okay.
you can't hear him at all. So what are you doing? Just kind of giving giving you guys a promo. So I went ahead and pulled that slide down. Do you wanted to close out with a song, Dan? Is there something you had in mind, or were you?
I thought I might do the one about the Cutter Mackinac. It's pretty short and it's lively and quick.
I love
And then
it.
while you guys are doing that, I'll set up an after-hour Zoom group. Those that want to join it, great. If you guys can't make it, I understand. You already gave us an hour and a half of your time. We're very thankful for that. So, and just so you know, before you do that, I'm counting through several people. I mean, the biggest thing is how grateful they are that gave them something to do during the COVID-19 to watch. I mean, we've had an average of 20 people pretty much the whole time. So
wow.
All right, here he goes. Mackinac stays at the dock. She served us long and true. She pulls against her lines on land whenever gales blow through. She'd like to break the ice and be the mighty Mac once more, but she'll carry on her legacy from her tether on the shore. She'd venture out and brave a storm when others wouldn't sail. Through sheets of ice and walls of a rain she humbly would prevail. The ensign held her steady when she'd roll upon her side. Then mighty Mac would right herself to face the gales with pride. Coast Guard cutter serves the lakes as guardian of the seas, saving lives and breaking through when a ship's brought to her knees. While Navy ships more grandiose are known by war and fame, she is ours, we love her well, and Mackinaw's her name. Mackinaw's her name.
Thank you, brother. Appreciate everybody. If you'd like to meet with us, that'd be awesome.
all right, perfect, guys. Thank you very much. I popped into your guys' messenger the YouTube link or the Zoom link, and I'm going to pop it into the main channel here in just a minute. So again, thanks for your time, guys. I'll figure out the recording on it and get back with you later.
Perfect.
Thanks a lot, Tom.
Be well.
No, I appreciate your time. Thanks, guys.
You bet.
See you next time. Bye-bye.